So correction number one, it's not so much a correction, it's what I do when I speak as a minister. I don't teach a class. I don't do what we do in the men's class on Sunday morning. Men's class on Sunday morning, we will dig in and we will sometimes dig in deep and not get very far. This morning, we didn't get very far. I think we got through 7, 8 verses. There was a lot said in those 7 or 8 verses. We were covering 2 Corinthians, and Paul spread a really wide net. There was a reason we weren't getting far, and it was Paul's fault. But when I teach a class, yeah, we're going to dig in, and I'm going to stick strictly with where I'm at. When I preach a sermon, I'm sorry, I do not do that. I sort of do that, spread the net far, and I cover a lot, and I don't drill down into the one point made in the one passage that I start with. And in this case, I can't. What we're hearing today, last week, and the week before is one continuous thought by Christ. He's dealing with an issue that doesn't get nailed down in just 5 or 6 verses. And if there's been confusion because I am, quote unquote, taking it out of context because I'm not just hammering the one point, I'm sorry for that confusion. But like I said, what I'm talking about this week, last week, and the week before, Jesus is working on a problem. He started that out, from my message-wise, 2 weeks ago. We're going to hit the conclusion of that at the end of my sermon today, because he comes all the way back to where he started out 2 chapters ago. And I would encourage you, read all of 18. Take the time, though, to do what I would do in a class with 18. Pay real close attention, and we're going to cover that today because 18 is a problem chapter. Not because of what he had to say, but because of how we've heard it when we weren't really listening all the way to what Jesus himself was trying to communicate. And that's sort of the difference here between the fan and the player. Because the player who's out there on the field, it's like Chad this morning with his communion service. Chad doesn't get up here and put on airs. Chad comes from where Chad is at and relates the experience that Christ went through to the way Chad sees and understands it. And I appreciate that a ton, because you can get up here and give the floweriest communion service anybody's ever heard, and I'm just going to go, okay, what am I supposed to get out of that? When Chad gets up here, he might, okay, Chad made a little mistake. It wasn't Jesus, it was Paul, but that's okay, because I knew where Chad was going with it. I knew what Chad was trying to get across, and it was coming from here in Chad. Because this is where I meet Jesus. This is how I meet Jesus. This is how I relate to that. And I hear Chad, and I can go with that. Why? Chad is a player. He is living it. He's trying to apply it the best way he can from his understanding. And I appreciate a ton of that. And, okay, I am now going to go 100% against what I said last week. Not because I said it wrong, but because God has an awesome sense of humor. Last week I said, my boss never says in front of me what he thinks of me. Yesterday at homecoming, I get a phone call as I am en route to the university for a special dedication that's going to happen at our department. And it's a panic phone call from my boss. Rich, it doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. We have no streaming capability right now. I'm going to be there in 35 minutes. Okay, I'll see you when... No. Put the guys on from the streaming crowd. He puts the guys on from the streaming crowd. It doesn't work. We tested this Wednesday and it worked. Bing! Lie. They tested it Wednesday and it failed. I know because I was called Wednesday by the person who was panicking. It failed. We've got to get it set up for a totally different machine. Can you get this set up for us before Saturday? I said, thank you. Get me the number as soon as you can. I'll get that number to the appropriate people, and I will make sure they understand how critical this has got to be in ASAP. So I knew, one, he lied. Wednesdays failed big time. And I also knew why. The piece that they were using was broken and wasn't going to work, period. They were bringing a different device. I got that address in. So when he told me it didn't work, it's the machine we tested Wednesday. Yes, it will not work. Try the other machine. 5 minutes later, I get a text from my boss. We are streaming. And it's like, okay, cool. I knew why. I arrive at the university, 35 minutes later, wearing a sweatshirt, a polo, and shorts. I go to make sure my boss is still in a comfortable position. He looks like me today. The two gentlemen that are with him, whose pockets are very deep, who support us, are also wearing like I'm wearing today. And what he says is, gentlemen, have you met Rich Kelly before? He's our IT. And I turned to both of them. I've seen them many times over the years. They're on the executive committee. They are very important individuals. They have been coming back to UF longer than our current director has been a director at UF. It's like, yes, I recognize these gentlemen. Oh, well, we've never been introduced. And then my director turns to them and says, this is Rich Kelly. He is the lifeblood and heart of our department. We would not be as far along today as we are in all the changes we are currently going through if it weren't for him. We wouldn't be a department today if it weren't for the knowledge he has of everything this department has been doing over the years. I'm very thankful to have him. I didn't lie to y'all last week, but one, it all came back around. That wasn't the only seemingly untruth if you were with me this weekend. I told you last week what I do and why I do it, and why I do it for my kids, in the hopes that one day it will finally get through and they will recognize what I've been doing all along. Saturday morning, I get the email from Matthew. Dad, I got stuck in my sermon again. I need a little bit of help. So I get his sermon, and I'm at the university, hiding up in my office, trying not to be seen in my sweats, making sure I'm available if something goes wrong. And I start editing his sermon. And I realized, okay, you need an example here, and I put that in there. And I'm going through and I fix his couple of typos, and I get to the end. One, I was saying, thank you, Lord. This is funny. Because what I added to his sermon built on his ending like nobody's business. And then I read his ending. And it blew me away because it starts out, you all may not know it, but my dad shows me how much he loves me every week and shows me how much he loves my brother every week. Because every Friday morning, my dad gets up at 3:15 in the morning to drive an hour to pick me up, to drive another hour to take me to Lake Butler, so that he can spend time with me, with my brother, talking to us, making sure we're on the right page when it comes to our work in God's ministry. And you could say that's how my dad shows me he loves me, but it doesn't start there. It started 20 years ago when I was a little kid and we were taking care of Alexis. And my dad was getting up in the middle of the night because my dad was in a different room, but he could hear when my sister couldn't breathe. And he would get up in the middle of the night and he then goes on and delivers his hammer blow of an invitation about Alexis. My kids do listen to what I've been doing and have heard. And I am so thankful. I'm in tears not because of what they said about me, but because they heard. And that means so much to me, because I know that means they're working on a right path, and that's what I'm most concerned about. It's the difference between being a fan of God and working for what he's working for. Not because it makes me that better loving dad, but because it makes them in his kingdom. And that's what concerns me the most. And the picture, as some people have already joked about, is that your car? No, it's not. I'm like the guy that would put that on his monitor. And yes, I do have a picture of that car as one of my backgrounds sometimes. I don't own that car. I can't tell you what it's like to drive that car. And if I were to talk about that car, you'd realize it after a little while. He's got no clue. I'm not the Chad of that car. I don't have the experience behind the wheel of that car. I can't relate to that car because I'm not a player. I'm not the driver. I might be a fan of how neat it looks, but that's about the extent of it. I'm not coming to you from reality if I was talking about that car, like Chad comes to us when he talks about what he's thinking about, when he's thinking about the perfect sacrifice, and what it meant to try to do all that he did, and yet he did it. And when we start thinking about the best that this world has to offer, it doesn't compare. Because when it comes to following God's example, unfortunately, we're in chapter 18. We're going to be talking a lot about fans, not players. Or when I say we, God, through his Son, talks a lot about fans and not players. And we're going to start from the answer that I already read earlier and work backwards. Luke 18:8. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth? When is he coming back? He's going to be dying relatively soon. He comes back after 3 days. And after the 40 days, what happens? He ascends. And some who were present doubted. Even after all that we talked about last week, what did they see? All those miracles. What did those who were there when he ascends on high see? A resurrected Christ who walked the earth for 40 days. A resurrected Christ who didn't just rise from the grave, he rose up from the earth to ascend to be with God the Father, and they had doubt. That's the kind of people Jesus is talking to in chapter 18. No, that's the kind of people he was talking to back in 16, in 17, and now in 18. Because when we jump back to verse 1, then he spoke a parable to them that men always ought to pray and not lose hope, or not lose heart. A parable. What's a parable? A truth they can understand, a reality they can understand that has a deeper spiritual meaning that they aren't getting yet. And that's why he's telling it to them this way. Saying, There was a certain city, or in a certain city, a judge who did not fear God, nor regard man. Now there was a widow in that city, and she came to him saying, get justice for me from my adversary. I've been wronged. I want it made right. You're the one in power. You're the one who's the authority. You're the one who's supposed to make this right. And who is he? Someone who doesn't fear God, but he is the power. He is the authority. He's the worldly power. He's the worldly authority. And as we continue on, and he would not for a while, but after he said within himself, though I do not fear God, nor regard man, yet because this widow troubles me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. And where's the worldly power still? Still with him. He still has the authority. He might be giving his authority over in a sense and giving up. Excuse me. Because I just can't take her coming and badgering me. This is the worldly setting. They can understand what's going on. Now, hear what Jesus has to say. Then the Lord said, hear what the unjust judge said. And shall God not avenge his own elect who cry out day and night to him? Though he bears long with them, I tell you, he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth? Unfortunately, what do we hear? What we tend to hear is, his own elect cry out day and night to him. Will he not avenge them speedily? And we miss what he really was saying to them. Who's long-suffering? Not his people. Who was long-suffering? God was long-suffering. Whoa. Why has he got to be long-suffering? Though he bears long with them. Not with the world. Who's the them? His own people. When do you have to bear long with somebody? When they're being the problem. And you're dealing with it. God is bearing long with his own people. Who's Jesus talking to right then? The Jews. God's own people. The Jews who weren't seeking God still. God was still being long-suffering with them. Won't he be speedy? Because unlike the unjust God, when they finally turn to God, isn't he going to do what he's done every single time in the Old Testament? When they would finally in desperation turn to God, what did God do? Redeemed his people from their bondage in Egypt. Redeemed his people every single time in Judges, no matter how messed up they were before and would be afterwards. God is long-suffering. That was the truth. God is hearing his people's cries while he's still being long-suffering. Because while they're complaining about how bad it is, all they're doing is complaining about how bad it is. Who's long-suffering? God is. Who's long-suffering? For his own people. We need to hear that. I guess I need to speak up if you need to hear me. Continuing on. Long-suffering with them. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on earth? What did he find? Only 120, and they doubted. It's not until Pentecost that they start to get a clue, just like all the way back to Egypt. How many plagues did God do? 10. Doesn't do them boom, 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 boom. It seems like that when we read it, but if you pay close attention, it's a significant period of time that this is happening over. They're getting a chance to see it, think about it. See it and think about it. See it and think about it. And after all 10, guess what? They're still doubting. It's not until the waves come crashing down on the Egyptians they finally believe. Wasn't the 10 plagues. It wasn't the pillar that's keeping them safe from all those Egyptians that they could not pass through, meaning the Egyptians couldn't pass through the cloud by day or the fire by night. That wasn't enough to keep them believing or get them to believe. It wasn't even when the waters part and they go through on dry ground. When the waters come crashing in on top of the Egyptians is when they finally believed. This isn't a new message from God to man that Jesus was bringing. What did we talk about last week? Faith. The right kind of faith. The faith that wasn't being displayed by his own people that he's talking to then. Because God is being long-suffering even when Jesus is delivering this message. 9. Also, he spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. Who's he talking to? Those who came to hear him. His disciples. And if you doubt me on that, we're going to hit that, and I am so telling you the truth. His disciples trusted in themselves that they were righteous, and they despised others. And we're going to see that one before we finish, if I hurry up. We know the parable about the two men who go up to pray. Think about what gets said about the Pharisee. Went to the temple to pray, prayed, thanked God. I am not an extortioner. I am not unjust. I am not an adulterer. I am not a traitor to your people, taking money from another nation, handling the money you told us not to touch. I am so not the wrong. And he tells the truth. He's not any of those things. He goes and prays. He's thankful to God. He fasts twice a week. He gives his tithes of all that he possesses. Not just what I received this week. I give a tithe of all I possess. I go above and beyond. I give the better kind of tithe. I am doing the right. And I'm trusting in that, because who am I praying to? It says right there, prayed to himself or with himself. Trusted in themselves, trusted in their righteousness. I didn't name off anything he did wrong as far as the life he was living, not being the sinner, doing the fasting, doing the tithing. In and of itself, all those are right things, right works. But there's a big, humongous problem. It was right without God. And I don't care how right anything is. Without God, right is nowhere. Why? Because what makes it truly right? Is there something special, awesomely right about fasting? No. I fasted for 3 days. I I fasted for 9 days, blew it after day 9, and fasted for the next 30 without a break. I'm sorry, a shot of coffee does not count as a break. I blew it. I broke it. I did wrong. That's why after the 9 days, I did the full 30. I'm not boasting. I failed. But the fasting in and of itself is nothing great. It doesn't accomplish any good on its own. It accomplishes awesome when it's with God. Jesus even has to tell him, why couldn't we cast these out? Why couldn't we? It takes prayer and fasting. Why? Not because it takes prayer and fasting of itself. It's because you're that weak still. You've got to start going forward with God in your prayers, in your fasting, because what aren't they doing right here? His own disciples aren't praying to God. They're praying to themselves. They're counting on how right they are. Oh, by the way, he's not talking only to them then. He's talking to us today. Because unfortunately, people still can get caught up in how good they are. Goodness without God doesn't do you any good. It's good for nothing. It really is. And we have the opposite. And the tax collector standing afar off, not willing to come close to God because he knows what he really is, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven because he knew what he really was. Beat his breast saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And that's who I am. I'm a sinner. I can't stack any good, whether that be fasting or anything else, up as though it amounts to anything. Because without God, it's nothing. Paul will say, all that I have done is dross before God, because it doesn't measure up to what he does through his Son at Calvary. It doesn't matter how right Paul was when he said that, or how wrong the tax collector was when he prayed. What mattered for both of them is that they were praying to God, that what they were doing would be seen through God's mercy, not through their rightness. And I realize I've pushed beyond because I've gotten into some things. You want to read chapter 18. Read it closely to what he's really saying. Because the tax collector is the one God heard. He didn't get heard because he was a sinner. He got heard because he acknowledged, God, I am so messed up and I need your mercy. That's what the Pharisee needed to be praying. That's what the disciples needed to hear and understand. It's what we need to hear and understand today. Because his disciples are the ones that will turn away the children. You hear me? The ones who were following him weren't hearing him for what he was saying, and because they weren't hearing him yet, they had the heart to turn away the children. Jesus isn't threatening them, and this goes all the way back to my Malachi sermon. It wasn't a threat. He's warning. It's like we said in class this morning for the men. Why was Paul trying to reach those in Corinth? It wasn't to put a feather in his cap and say, look what I did in saving these messed up people. No. Paul desperately wanted them to hear the love God offered. Because it wasn't the importance of the messenger, it was the one who sent the message. In Luke 16 through 18, when you take the time to read it, listen for the God and what God is doing and offering in spite of what the disciples were thinking at the time. Lord, increase our faith because we so can't forgive people the way you're asking. That's what they were saying. We need to realize if we don't hear the words of God, we'll turn out just like them. If we hear the words of God, we'll be able to say, thank you, God, that my kids heard. And we'll mean it with every fiber of our being, because that's what was important. It's about hearing God because He's the one that will make all the difference. It's about taking His Son on in baptism because in obeying God, He's offering the difference for our families that we need. He's offering the difference for us that we need. And if we don't get that point, we'll never get it right to getting it to our kids. If you need to take Him on in baptism or you need the prayers of the church, you're welcome to come as we stand and sing.